How can we bridge the gap between philosophy and politics? More specifically, how can we bridge the gap between 19th century philosophy and 21st century politics? Well, perhaps we can do so by connecting Nietzschean thought to the contemporary American populism. Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher and critic of society and author whose most popular works include Thus Spoke Zarathustra and The Gay Science. He is most widely recognized for speaking out against religion and religion's association with society, and he explored existence, he explored human meaning, he explored the purpose of life and values, especially in the lens of society and religion. Now, the three concepts that most align with power, which is what I'll be looking at, are as follows. Will to power, which is the innate drive to assert dominance over oneself and others. 2, resentment, which is a deep-seated feeling of hatred and self-abasement. So if I stub my toe in the doorway, I get mad at someone else, I am shifting the blame onto an inappropriate source. And 3, the Übermensch. The Übermensch is a theoretical individual who has risen above the values, the issues, and the religions of mankind to create his or her own values. And this directly translates to English to the overman. And these will all together be referred to as the conceptual triad. Now, when we look at it here, we have resentment. And resentment is the baseline. It restricts will to power. You cannot exert will to power if you are suffering from resentment. Now, when will to power is fully and completely exerted, you get the Übermensch. But the Übermensch is fully free from resentment. Now, where have we seen this before? We've seen Nietzsche in Nazi Germany. From approximately 1933 to 1945, we saw the Nazis warping Nietzschean thought to support the idea of eugenics. They took the fact that the Übermensch could exist, they took the idea that there could be someone who can rise above man to support the idea that we can have all blue eyes and blonde hair. They also saw Nietzsche's critiques as a scathing review of the 1800s and the late 1800s, not the 1930s and not the 1940s. They saw the turn of the century as a signifier of change. We've also seen this in Russia, specifically within the Russian Revolution. From approximately 1917 to 1923, Russian theologists and thinkers manipulated Nietzschean thought in order to support socialism. So as socialist factions rose and fell, so did support for Nietzsche, and so did his incorporation within both religion and socialism go. Now, the perversion that God is dead also occurred by Russian theologists. They took his notion that God is dead to support the existence of a new God, to support the existence of Christianity becoming anew, especially under a newfound socialist regime. Now, all the way back in the realm of politics in the 21st century, it's important to know what grievance politics is. So grievance politics is a political strategy that revolves around status and resentment. Not resentment, but resentment. So we've seen this in Nazism. We also discussed this within the Russian Revolution. Now, a subset of grievance politics, or an ideology that exists within grievance politics, is populism, which is where we'll largely be for this presentation. So this is a political ideology that divides society into two distinct sides that are at odds with one another. So you might see this in Bernie Sanders, who is a left-wing populist in the United States, or Donald Trump, who is a right-wing populist in the United States. Now, across my literature review, there were several sources that took Nietzschean thought, or they took ideas that Nietzsche expressed, and incorporated them in the lens of politics. But most specifically, it was in the lens of grievance politics, not populism. So for instance, Capellos et al. 2024 looked at resentment, collective narcissism, and reactionism within the broader scope of grievance politics. We've also seen other connections between the three components of the conceptual triad and modern experiences and values. For instance, we've seen the Übermensch being related to a mask for vulnerability, or resentment being seen as a catalyst for vicious extremist online attitudes, or will to power and its usage within interpersonal relationships. But not once have any components of Nietzschean thought or the conceptual triad been expressed or analyzed or researched in the context of American populism. So that led me to my research question. How has Nietzsche's conceptual triad of will to power, resentment, and the Übermensch been present in left and right-wing populist rhetoric in the United States since 2015? Well, I hypothesized as a result of my literature review that Nietzsche's conceptual triad will be most present in both right and left-wing populist rhetoric in the United States though the Übermensch and will to power will be most present in right-wing populist rhetoric, and in left-wing populist rhetoric, ressentiment will be the most present. So how did I figure this out? Well, I conducted a qualitative discourse analysis utilizing a Google search engine and a roll call transcript database as pictured here and here. I analyzed 30 speeches, again, from Google and from roll call transcript database. This means there were 15 from Donald Trump and 15 from Bernie Sanders, who we mentioned before, and they were specifically chosen because they were intended to represent both right and left-wing populism, respectively. Now, there were 6 speeches from 2016, that's 3 from Trump and 3 from Sanders, 6 from 2018, 2020, 2022, and last but not least, 2024. So I also had to collect my data, and I did so by creating 3 specific tables, one for each concept of the conceptual triad: will to power, ressentiment, and the Übermensch. There were 6 overarching themes which attempted to fully encapsulate the themes of each concept, and then 7 associated vocabulary words and phrases that also attempted to encapsulate every single concept. Now, it is important to note that expressing the concept of a vocabulary word without actually mentioning that vocabulary word was still coded on the table, even though the word is not actually on there. So if the word might be defeat, and Trump was talking about the word defeat, but he didn't actually specifically say the word, it was still counted on the table. Now, we'll go into further detail on this with my collection process. First, the transcript of each speech was selected. So for any given speech, I followed a set of guidelines. It had to be between about 1,000 to 12,000 words. There had to be a set audience, meaning that it could not have something where the politician just spoke to a camera and then released it afterwards. And then tables were applied to the speech. So I ran through them about 4 times. Once, I read through the speech in its entirety. 2, I did so with one table, then another table, and then another table, and then again. And so associated concepts were also coded onto each table after reading through the initial tables. And then this is extremely important. The surrounding context of each concept was noted. So this allowed me to put the word count and the total context together, and this contributed to the percentage of the word count that actually consisted of references. And so the reason I did this was because without it, you can see that 7, 9, and 14 references in a 2,766 word speech seems very, very significant. It seems like it almost might be the entire part of the speech, but it's really only 12%. And so the percentages put it in the context of the speech's word count. My results. So how did I come up with this? What did I find? Well, this is the biannual percentage of Nietzschean thought in populism. So this is the percentage of thought, which is formulated from a modified percent proportion formula, which is what we just discussed. And you can see here, Donald Trump began with about 0.2% of Nietzschean thought within his speeches, and Bernie Sanders began with a staggering 12%. And they both slowly rose up until 2022. And in 2022, Sanders more than doubled the percent of references, and Donald Trump quadrupled it. He quintupled it. But then afterwards, we see a slight decline, and this might be because of the Russo-Ukrainian war, the midterm elections, or perhaps the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Now, we also have to break it down just a little bit more. So this is the total makeup of the conceptual triad in the context of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. So we can see with the will to power, it was overwhelmingly utilized by Donald Trump or the right wing. We can see that it was utilized a total of 15 times, with 10 of those times being from Trump and only 5 being from Bernie Sanders. A very similar thing happened with ressentiment, where it was used a total of 12 times, but Sanders used it 8 times and Trump only 4 times. Now, all the way over here with the Übermensch, it's important to note it only occurred 3 times, and 2 of those times were from Bernie Sanders. Now, we can also see that the most common concept per transcript creates almost a trend. We see Sanders had the Übermensch, will to power, ressentiment, will to power. There's almost a mix of everything equally. But then as we go further down and closer to 2022 and 2024, we get more and more ressentiment in a row. So this means this could be a result of political polarization or simply him adjusting his own rhetoric. But with Trump, we don't necessarily see the same thing. We see ressentiment, will to power, will to power, will to power, ressentiment. There seems not to be such a more specific pattern, and then even all the way in 2022 and 2024, we're on ressentiment, will to power, etc. Now, I also took it a step further by classifying the audiences of each speech into 5 distinct categories. So out of 30 audiences, I categorized them into 5. The voting audience, the student audience, the general audience, the member audience, and last but not least, the Senate audience. And so this allowed me to look at the conceptual triad in the context of each distinct type of audience to see when or how Sanders or Trump applied the Nietzsche concepts. So for Donald Trump, he overwhelmingly used will to power, with the exception of the voting audience, which he utilized ressentiment with. Very similar thing with Bernie Sanders, where everything was ressentiment across the board, except for the member audience, which he also utilized will to power for. Now let's discuss it, let's figure out what this all means, and we're going to break it down to something that's a lot easier. So, ressentiment, we found, is most utilized by Bernie Sanders. It corroborates also the findings of Johnson 2021, who argued that Sanders utilizes ressentiment to further his political rhetoric. Now, all the way over here, will to power is most utilized by Donald Trump. This also expands on the analysis of MAGA structures, or Make America Great Again structures, that were conducted by Koenig and Mendelberg 2024. Now, it's important to note that the lack of an Übermensch might be explained by Rare 2006 and Dennis 2014, who both looked at the Übermensch in the context of the Nazi Party and the Russian Revolution. So the Übermensch may just be a product of late-stage populism or grievance politics, rather than the stage that we're in, and so therefore my scope of research did limit that. Now, what does this mean? How does this apply to us? How does this apply to the political landscape? Well, over here on the left wing, we can see that a left-wing populist, understanding how successful Bernie Sanders has been, may want to utilize themes of ressentiment. They may want to express suffering and mistreatment, or appeal to the evaluation of power just as Bernie Sanders had. Now, all the way over here on the right wing, we can see that a right-wing populist might want to utilize themes of will to power just as Donald Trump has. They might want to express visionary leadership. They may want to express or appeal to the creation of ideas. Now, from a nonpartisan standpoint, politics as a whole, Nietzschean thought might really influence political success. It might mean the resurgence of philosophical and moral rhetoric in politics. It might mean something beyond just grievance politics or beyond just populism. However, these findings are partially limited by, one, my method. So I only utilized 126 words, and so that limited the extent to which each concept's definitions and the synonyms of those definitions could be applied to the tables and also to the transcripts. And then also, again, the time span of my research could have limited the Übermensch's presence, though that could be a subject of future research. And then also the United States Senate, this is very important to note, was Sanders' primary 2022 and 2024 audience. So the fact that ressentiment was utilized significantly more by Bernie Sanders may not signify a shift to ressentiment, but might just mean that Bernie Sanders prefers to utilize ressentiment among his senator colleagues. Now, this is also limited by my findings. So my findings are only generalizable to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Not one individual beyond those two, even if they claim to share the same exact beliefs, can this be applicable to. Now, it's also important to note that the definitions of the conceptual triad that I utilized and that I shared with you may misrepresent Nietzschean thought. This is because Nietzsche never explicitly defines his concepts, and so everything that I said or utilized was simply repeating the most common, widely accepted, appropriate definitions of each concept. Now, this is also not applicable beyond the United States or to any politician, so you can't take what I found here and bring that to Boris Johnson, for instance, because even though they're both populists, it just does not work. Now, future research. How might this influence future research? Well, the conceptual triad might be applied to other contemporary populists. Like we might take it to Boris Johnson and do the same exact research on his end to see where he stands, rather than taking what I've already found and just applying it to him. We can also look at it in the context of American voters to see where an American voter sits on the political spectrum and on a philosophical spectrum, or with Nietzschean ideas. This also might work when we look at the relationship between the Nazi Party, or the Russian Revolution, and modern populist initiatives. You think of the Podemos Party, a very progressive populist initiative in Spain. How can we relate them back to the Nazi Party? Because they could not seem any more opposite. But can Nietzschean thought build that bridge? Could Nietzschean thought be the bridge between philosophy and politics? But more specifically, can it be the bridge between 19th century philosophy and 21st century politics? Thank you.
How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
Absolutely. So throughout my methodology, I was initially wanting to do a literature review, or not a literature review. I was initially wanting to do a content analysis, but then as I was going through my literature review, I saw that a lot of individuals weren't really relying on just a content analysis because of its high subjectivity, and there were other issues associated with it. And so I looked at my own research and I decided that maybe I wanted to do a qualitative discourse analysis instead, something a lot more specific. And so with that, I decided maybe I wanted to use tables because I wanted to create my own textual analysis tool, but it was incredibly difficult. And so over the course of a month or 2 months, I was sitting there thinking, how can I take inspiration from others' research, but not feel like I'm fully relying on the research? And so my research process was very much impacted by how much I wanted to take from others' research and how much I wanted to take from my own mind, and then mushing those two together to create a qualitative discourse analysis that meant something to me and that could very accurately, or a lot more accurately, depict Nietzschean thought and populism and lead me to my research question than something like a content analysis.
What are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
Absolutely. So beyond what I've already mentioned, my research findings might suggest that Nietzschean thought is a lot more popular or present than we assume so today. You look at the Nazi Party again, or the Russian Revolution, and you see that Nietzsche was the front and center of a lot of the rhetoric, and they utilized what he had to say and they took it to support their own values. And so what I found might mean that Nietzsche is still there. He might still be, his ideas, Nietzschean thought might still be underneath the rhetoric that we use today, or the ideas or the ideologies and convictions that we share today. He still might be there, but he's not at the front and center. So this sort of pushes the idea that maybe philosophy is really underneath politics, and maybe there's not even a bridge, it's just underneath it all along, and nobody's just been able to dive under the surface and really take a look at what do your values mean and where do those values come from, where are they derived from, because they may or may not be derived from Friedrich Nietzsche.
Great, thank you.
What was the most important research skill you developed as a result of this process, and how might you apply it to your future endeavors?
Absolutely. So the most important research skill that I learned was identifying a gap. By far, it was looking at what people had not done before and then doing it. That was something that was incredibly fulfilling. It was something that I found so much interest in doing, and it was incredibly difficult, and that's why I liked it so much, because I had to read through dozens of papers to find what they weren't talking about. It's easy to identify what somebody's talking about. It's a lot more difficult to identify what people aren't talking about and to synthesize so many papers together to find a single small gap where you can fit your niche into. And so that's what I had to do, and I can bring that further in college, where I'm going to perform more research. And so having already done this, it sets me up to look for certain gaps within a wide range of scholarly sources and interdisciplinary sources, from politics to philosophy, and even further into my career, where I'll have to do what people haven't done before in order to break the mold, or to do something different that other applicants for a program or a position might not do. How can I find a gap there? How can I worm my way into it and look at what people have not done before?
Okay, thank